Buenas tardes, mi nombre es Kevin Núñez y soy estudiante de la carrera de Geología en la Universidad Católica del Norte. Fundación Puerto Idea y Escondida les da la más cordial bienvenida a la siguiente actividad de esta nueva versión del Festival de Ciencias de Puerto Idea Antofagasta. A continuación podrán disfrutar de la conferencia Cómo no construir una máquina consciente, a cargo del neurocientífico británico Anil Seth, quien durante casi 2 décadas ha estudiado el misterio de la conciencia humana. En esta oportunidad nos hablará sobre las posibilidades, perspectivas y peligros de la conciencia artificial en máquinas, comparando la ciencia con la ciencia ficción y estableciendo las diferencias entre conciencia e inteligencia. Esperamos que disfruten de esta interesante actividad.
Hello, my name is Anil Seth. Mi nombre es Anil Seth y estoy muy contento de estar aquí para hablar con ustedes por día a día sobre cómo se puede construir o no construir las máquinas conscientes. How not to build a conscious machine, and I'll speak in English from now on. Now, whenever people think about artificial intelligence and conscious machines, bad things tend to happen, whether it's Frankenstein in Mary Shelley's book, whether it's in Blade Runner, or whether it's in this recent film, Ex Machina by Alex Garland. Conscious machines have a habit of wreaking havoc in our world. So, when we move beyond the realm of science fiction, what I want to talk about today is what are the prospects for building not just intelligent machines, but conscious machines? And should we even be trying? The first thing to talk about in this area is really the relationship between consciousness and intelligence. And when we think about intelligence, what's the definition of intelligence? Well, intelligence is really doing the right thing at the right time. That is the most general definition that we have of what it is to be intelligent. And there are many examples already of artificial systems, of machines or computer programs that seem to be intelligent. There's this recent development called AlphaGo from the British company DeepMind, which was able to beat the world champion at Go. There's now, of course, AlphaGo Zero, which can do this completely from scratch. So artificial systems can already be intelligent in very, very narrow domains. And of course, animals, not just humans, but many other animals are intelligent too. Honeybees, for instance, can find food and find resources and remember where they are over large distances. Animals generally tend to be able to do the right thing at the right time in much more flexible ways than current machines can. And human intelligence in particular is highly general. Imagine if you arrive in a new city. It's challenging, but quite easy in the sense to find your way around, to find how to use a map, how to use the public transport, even though you're in a completely different place. We tend to be very good at figuring out what to do and when to do it, even in situations we've not encountered before. Current machine intelligence is not very good at this kind of thing. So that's intelligence. And what about consciousness? Well, consciousness is very different from intelligence. At its most fundamental, for a conscious creature, there is something it is like to be that creature. There's some kind of conscious experience going on, some kind of, any kind of conscious experience will do. It doesn't have to be a particularly sophisticated one, just has to be something happening for that creature, an experience of pain, a visual experience, a memory, a thought. All of these are conscious experiences. Now, there are two kinds of consciousness we can think about. There's what's called phenomenal consciousness. You can think about this as just raw experience, the redness of red, the painfulness of pain, the visual experience of seeing a blue sky. That's phenomenal consciousness. And there's also access consciousness. And that has to do with what we can do because we are conscious, function. So for instance, when I'm conscious of seeing a glass of water on the table, I can pick it up and drink from it. I can throw it across the table. I can remember it. I can tell somebody about it. There are many things I can do because I'm conscious of something. And that's a separate way to think about consciousness. This distinction is due to the philosopher Ned Block. And we'll see that machine consciousness might have more to do with the latter, with access consciousness, than with phenomenal consciousness. I also tend to think of consciousness not just as one single thing about experience, but as many different ways in which we can be conscious. There's for instance, conscious level, which is this difference between being unconscious, being asleep or under anesthesia, and being awake and aware as we are now. There's conscious content, which is the experience of the perceptual scene that you're having when you are conscious, the sights and sounds and smells, memories and emotions that populate any given conscious experience. And finally, there's conscious self, the experience of being an individual, of being the subject of conscious experiences. These are all different ways of being conscious. So that's how to think about consciousness, and it's not the same thing as intelligence. So why then do people, and this is quite a common idea that I think is out there in culture, that artificial intelligence is somehow on the route to artificial consciousness. This is the idea that as machines get smarter and smarter, and AI is growing in its sophistication very rapidly all the time, that there'll come some moment where the lights come on and the artificial systems that we're building become aware, become self-aware, become sentient, become conscious. This is a common assumption, but I think it's a very strange assumption, and I don't think it's particularly justified, and that many things drive it. And I want to just talk about a few of the things that drive people to assume that artificial intelligence is on this inevitable path towards artificial consciousness. The first factor driving people's beliefs in this is, of course, science fiction, where we started. There are so many examples in science fiction of artificial intelligence that at some point becomes aware. I mentioned Ex Machina at the beginning and Frankenstein. My favorite is HAL 9000 from the classic film 2001, which seems to be a conscious computer. Of course, if you build that assumption in through culture, people tend to assume that, well, that's what's going to happen. The second thing driving this assumption that AI will lead to artificial consciousness is this idea of the singularity. And this is quite a popular idea these days, that technology is accelerating at an ever increasing rate, that the rate of growth of AI is somehow exponential, and that we're rapidly approaching this moment in history when artificial intelligence will exceed human level intelligence and will bootstrap itself beyond our understanding and beyond our control. This may or may not be the case, but the issue with an exponential curve is that wherever you are on it, things look impossibly steep in front of you and irrelevantly flat when you look backwards. So you have no idea where you actually are on this curve. And it's kind of a slight hubris. It's kind of strange that we think as a society, we're at this critical point in this curve where AI is about to take off and render us irrelevant. Of course, science fiction promotes that view as well. And this goes along with the idea that at this point where AI bootstraps itself beyond our understanding control is also the point at which AI becomes conscious. I don't see why that we should necessarily think that way. Then there are some other, I think, more deeply seated reasons why people think, or it's thought, that artificial intelligence might become conscious. One of the things here is this philosophical perspective called functionalism. This is a very common view to hold about the relationship between physical things and conscious experiences. And it's this idea that what makes something conscious is not what it's made out of, but what it does. So we all know that computers, at least modern computers, are made out of silicon. They're made out of wires and circuits and things like that. Whereas the brain is made out of wetware. It's made out of neurons and chemicals. It's a chemical machine, not a silicon device. Functionalism says this doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what a system is made out of. It just matters what it does. Another aspect to this idea of functionalism is that all that matters for a system is how it maps inputs to outputs. You have some input, which for a brain might be the sensory signals, and then you have some output, which is, well, what the brain does given those sensory signals. And the idea here is that intelligence is indeed thought of this way, that you can have an intelligent system made out of anything, and intelligence is doing the right thing at the right time. So if you just implement the right mapping from input to output, then you have something that actually is intelligent. So functionalism, this idea that it doesn't matter what the thing is made out of, just what it does, applies very well to intelligence, but it's not clear at all that it applies to consciousness. We don't have any examples we know of conscious systems that are made out of things other than real brains. And also, we just don't know why the input-output mappings that matter for consciousness should be those that are associated with intelligence. Again, intelligence and consciousness are not the same sorts of things. So why do we think they go together? Well, here's, I think, the last reason to bring up, which is that we humans think we're really special. We tend to put ourselves at the top of every pyramid and at the center of every circle. Anthropocentrism is this term which refers to our tendency to see the rest of the universe only in relation, or primarily in relation, to us. And we are intelligent, or at least we think we are intelligent as a species, and we are conscious. So we tend to think they go together, that intelligence and consciousness are tightly related. But that's just a consequence of seeing things through human eyes, being anthropocentric. We've known since Darwin and before that humans are not, in fact, so special. We are just one branch or one twig of this beautifully rich and delicate evolutionary tree. So there's no reason to think that intelligence and consciousness need go together in other animals, let alone in artificial systems, just because they go together in us as humans. So rather than thinking of consciousness as a necessary consequence of intelligence, there's what we can call a double dissociation. What does that mean? That just means that intelligence is not necessary for consciousness. You don't have to be smart to suffer. And intelligence is not sufficient for consciousness either. You can be intelligent, or you might have artificial systems that are intelligent that are not conscious. So here's how I like to think of it. This is a picture from a book that I have coming out later this year, where consciousness and intelligence are going in two different directions. Both consciousness and intelligence have many different aspects. They're multidimensional, but they pull in generally different directions. And you can see that for many creatures here, humans and monkeys and octopuses and mice, there's a general correlation. So the more intelligent you are, then perhaps you have more ways of being conscious. But for artificial systems, current artificial intelligence, general artificial intelligence, perhaps that intelligence can occur without then needing to be any conscious experience at all. There's nothing it is like to be a Mac, there's nothing it is like to be an iPhone, and there's probably nothing it is like to be any near-term future AI system, at least not just by making it more intelligent. So if artificial intelligence is not just naturally leading to artificial consciousness, well, what if we tried to not just assume it comes along for the ride, but actually build a machine that we have reason to believe is conscious from the outset? If our goal was building artificial consciousness, not building artificial intelligence. Well, here we have to ask what different theories of consciousness would predict. If we want to know whether an artificial system is conscious, we need a theory that will tell us what kinds of systems can be conscious. So in the next part of this talk, I want to just very briefly introduce 3 or 4 of our leading theories of consciousness and see what they have to say about the prospect of building a conscious machine. The first theory of consciousness, this is probably one of the most popular theories of consciousness, is called global workspace theory. And this theory says that consciousness happens when information is broadcast in a global workspace. And this is shown in these pictures here. So you can imagine the situation where, let's take vision, for example. You open your eyes, some visual signals enter your visual cortex. But if they just stay within your visual cortex, then no conscious experience happens. For you to have a visual experience as a result of these signals entering your visual cortex at the back of the brain, then they have to gain access to this global workspace, which is implemented in the front and across the middle, basically in a large area of the rest of your brain. And when information enters the global workspace, it becomes available for all sorts of other behaviors. It's like the example with the glass of water on my table. Once I'm conscious of something, I can speak about it, I can remember it, I can pick it up, I can behave very flexibly in ways that I can't do when information is available only unconsciously. So this is a theory really of access consciousness. It's about what we can do in virtue of being conscious. And there's a lot of good evidence for this theory in neuroscience when we compare what happens in the brain for an unconscious perception, when you flash an image very quickly, let's say, compared to when you consciously perceive something. You see the difference between just local activation and then this global activation of the brain. So that's one interesting theory. A second theory of consciousness says that consciousness happens when a higher order process re-represents lower order mental states, which is a bit of jargon. It's a bit of philosophical jargon. But what it really means, a little bit like the previous theory, that you become conscious. Again, let's take an example of some signals entering visual cortex. You're looking at a glass. That's not sufficient to be conscious, to have a conscious experience of that glass. To have a conscious experience, there has to be something else in the front of the brain looking down at that activity in the visual cortex and saying, ah, yes, that is a conscious mental state. And then you have a conscious experience. So it's this idea that you have something hierarchically above, deeper into the brain, that's looking down and evaluating what's going on somewhere else in the brain. That's a so-called higher order theory of consciousness. So on these theories, can we build a conscious machine? Well, the short answer is yes, we can. If you believe these theories, it's enough, and you can build machines that have these properties. You can build a machine that implements both a kind of global workspace and that has this higher order looking down representation of lower order representations. And that will give you a machine that on these theories should have conscious experiences. There was a paper in the journal Science of 3 or 4 years ago making exactly this case. And the interesting thing here is that if you build machines according to these theories, they will have very useful functions. They'll be able to behave very flexibly when they perceive sensory information, and they'll be able, through higher order mechanisms, to monitor their own performance, know when they've made mistakes, and so on. So these machines will be smart in ways that are a little like humans, and on these theories will also be conscious. These theories also assume functionalism. That is, they say that it doesn't matter what a system is made out of. They're very comfortable with the idea that machines made of silicon could be conscious as biological machines like us made out of neurons and wetware. Consciousness on these theories is nothing more than specific computations. So if you believe these theories, yes, you can have conscious machines. The next theory is again a very prominent and popular theory of consciousness, and it's called integrated information theory. And this theory says that the level of consciousness depends on the amount of integrated information generated by a system. This is a very interesting and different kind of theory developed by Giulio Tononi. You can see him in the bottom there. And this theory starts from observations about what conscious experiences are like. And I've just indicated 5 of them in this figure here, and I won't go through in detail. Basically, they say conscious experiences are unified. They're all bound together in a single conscious scene, and they're also highly informative, that every conscious experience that you have rules out the occurrence of a large number of alternative conscious experiences. And what integrated information theory does is it says, okay, if that's what conscious experiences are like for the experiencer, then what kinds of mechanisms are enough to implement those properties of information and integration? And then it makes lots of claims about the sorts of systems that would generate conscious experience. One of the things that integrated information theory explains is why in human brains or in animal brains, consciousness is more associated with the cortex, this heavily folded part of the brain that lies on the surface, and not with the cerebellum, which is this mini brain at the back of your brain, which actually has more neurons than the rest of your brain put together, but doesn't seem to be involved in consciousness. And on integrated information theory, the reason is that the cerebellum is like lots of little independent mini circuits that don't speak to each other very much. So there's no integration, and so there's no consciousness. The cortex, on the other hand, is full of complicated looping, reentrant, and recurrent circuits that is very good at generating integrated information. And so on this theory, you get consciousness. So that's what it explains about the basis of consciousness in human brains. But is it enough on this theory to build a conscious machine? And again, the answer is yes, but it's interesting because only sometimes. There's an interesting claim about integrated information theory, which is that it doesn't matter what a system is made out of on this theory. You can make it out of neurons, you can make a system out of silicon, you could make it out of Coca-Cola cans if you want. But it does matter how it's wired up. That is, only some ways of mapping input to output will generate conscious experience. And this is shown just in this very complicated figure, which I don't need to go into more than to say, on the right-hand side, you have a very complicated mapping of input to output, but it's all feed forward. Signals only flow in one direction. And if they only flow in one direction, you have no integrated information, you have no consciousness. On the left, you have a much simpler system in terms of its fewer elements and fewer connections, but there's lots of loopiness. It implements exactly the same function of input to output, but it does it in a way that now generates integrated information. So on this theory, it's not enough you can't just look at a system and see how it behaves in order to judge whether it's conscious. You have to see how it's wired up on the inside too. So that's a specific claim from integrated information theory, but it still says that it's possible to build a conscious machine. In fact, it makes the claim that there's lots of conscious machines already out there. Okay, the last theory that I want to talk about very briefly is the one that I tend to prefer, and it's called controlled hallucinations and beast machines. And this is a whole way of thinking about how the brain works and what it does. And the basic idea is predictive processing, or the brain is a prediction machine. So if you imagine being a brain trying to do something like perception, trying to figure out what's out there in the world, this is a complicated problem. And the brain doesn't just read sensory information and read it out like we might read a book, or take information in like a camera takes information from the rest of the world. No, the sensory signals that come into the brain are all very noisy and very ambiguous. And everything that we perceive is a sort of best guess. It's an interpretation based on the sensory input, not a direct readout of that sensory input. And the idea is that in the brain, we have this continual process of predictive processing or prediction error minimization, where the brain's best guesses or predictions are flowing from the inside out, the top down, these blue arrows. And sensory signals are prediction errors. They just tell the brain the difference between what it's predicting and what it's getting at every level of processing in the brain. And by the brain continually minimizing prediction errors everywhere and all the time by updating its predictions, the brain settles on a best guess of what's out there in the world, and that's what we perceive. There's much evidence for this kind of process in the brain, but I just wanted to give you a taste for it with this video that we made a few years ago with Kesuke Suzuki and my group, where we simulated what it would be like if the brain had very strong predictions to see dogs everywhere by running an algorithm that predicted very strongly dog. And you can see that it leads to a very unusual kind of perception. It's simulating a kind of phenomenology of what visual experiences would be like. And so there's a lot of work like this where we try and understand the nature of visual experience or of perception in terms of predictions and prediction errors. But it's not only the external world that we perceive, we also perceive having a body and indeed being a body. These are fundamental aspects of what being a conscious self is like. We experience part of the universe as our body, and we experience the body from within too, in terms of emotions and moods, and this very deep-seated experience of simply being a living organism. And this brings up this whole area of perception called interoception, which is the perception of the body from within. When we think about perception, we typically think of how we perceive the outside world, the world beyond our body, the world of tables and chairs and beaches and mountains. But a lot of perception fundamentally is about controlling and regulating the body itself. Emotions are exactly that. Emotions are perceptions of the body from within that tell us how well we're doing at staying alive, whether things feel good or whether things feel bad. It's basically an indication of how well we're doing at staying alive. And it operates by the same process. We have predictions about the internal state of the body and prediction errors. And by minimizing prediction errors that emanate from within the body, we can control the body, and we have perceptual experiences of the body, which are things like emotions and moods and so on. So perception for the body from within is perception for control. Now, there are very many reasons to think why this is fundamentally what brains do. There's a very deep mathematical principle, which I won't go into at all, called the free energy principle, which says that things that persist over time predict the consequences of, or rather they are predictive models of themselves. Organisms that maintain themselves in the states they expect to be in over time must be predictive models of their own integrity, of themselves over time. And you can sort of, from this very basic principle in physics, derive that brains encode predictive models of themselves and of the world. But I won't go into the maths there. Just conceptually, what this way of thinking tells us is that consciousness is not so much associated with intelligence, but is more associated with life here, because we can think of the brain as fundamentally in the business of keeping the body alive. And so consciousness, our experiences, since they're all entailed by or involved predictions, are very closely associated with our status as living organisms. And I find this a very fascinating way to think, because it challenges one of the most famous philosophers of mind, and in fact, most famous philosophers of all time, René Descartes. And René Descartes is best known for saying that mental stuff, the stuff of conscious experience, is very different from the stuff of the material world. He drew this sharp distinction between res cogitans, stuff of thought, and res extensa, the stuff of matter, of tables and chairs and brains and bodies. But he also drew a very sharp distinction between mind and life. And he did this because he didn't want to admit that non-human animals had conscious rational minds. So he said the fact that they are alive and that they have flesh and blood and they bleed, and they said that's nothing to do. You can't from that infer that they have conscious minds. He called other animals beast machines. He said without minds to direct their bodily movements, animals must be regarded as unthinking, unfeeling machines that move like clockwork. Now, I think the opposite might be the case entirely, that because all the mechanisms that involve us perceiving the world and the self are all grounded in regulating the body, that conscious selfhood and all consciousness emerges because of, and not in spite of, our beast machine nature. We perceive the world and the self with, through, and because of our living bodies. So I spent a bit more time on this theory because it's the one that I find most appealing. It explains more what it's like to be a conscious self. And is this enough to build a conscious machine? Well, it depends. The answer is maybe. There's one way to interpret this theory, which is that understanding human consciousness and animal consciousness requires understanding its relation to life, that we perceive the world with, through, and because of our living bodies. But it may also be that conscious machines need to be living machines. This is the idea of what's called biological naturalism, that you have to be alive to be conscious. Now, I don't know which of those things is true. The first one is definitely true for me, that we can't understand consciousness unless we understand the nature of the living body and the relationship of the brain to the living body. It may also be true that only living things can be conscious, but for me, that's still an open question. Okay, now in the last few minutes, I want to ask about what we should do given this, given that we have various theories that predict different things about the likelihood and possibilities of building conscious machines. What should we now do? What should we do and what should we not do? The first thing to say here is there's an enormous challenge in just figuring out if we've been successful, whether we wanted to or not, in building a conscious machine. There's the very well-known Turing test, which Alan Turing developed in the 1950s as a thought experiment to decide whether machines could think. And the Turing test was the idea that if a human observer can no longer tell the difference between a machine pretending to be a human and another human, then that machine has passed the Turing test. And if it passes the Turing test, that's sufficient for saying the machine can think and is intelligent. The Turing test is a test of intelligence. It's not a test of consciousness. So it's not sufficient for something passing the Turing test to say, okay, it's conscious. We need something else. And that something else, I think, is going to be called the Garland test. And this does come back to this film I mentioned at the very beginning called Ex Machina, directed by Alex Garland. And this is different from the Turing test because it's now a test of consciousness rather than a test of intelligence. The scientist Murray Shanahan, who works at DeepMind in England, he was one of the advisors for Ex Machina and coined this term, the Garland test, after a bit of dialogue in the film. And the bit of dialogue simply says, yeah, like the challenge is to show you that this robot is in fact a machine and see whether you feel it's conscious. So it's the same thing. Can a human really tell the difference between a machine and a conscious system? And if not, then it passes the test and we say that it's conscious. But of course, it's really a test of the human and not a test of the machine. So these tests are not really fully reliable tests of whether a machine is intelligent or conscious, more a test of what it takes to persuade us as humans that something is intelligent or conscious. So we face a fundamental uncertainty about the extent to which we can ever be sure about intelligence or consciousness in a machine. So that makes things more complicated, given that we might not even know whether we've been successful or not. And then there are the ethics of artificial consciousness. Should we even be trying to build a conscious machine? Now, many people, I think this is something desirable, that if we could, it would be a grand success for our science and our technology. We've built conscious machines. This is amazing. We now live in a science fiction world. I am not sure. In fact, I really don't think this is a good idea. And if anything, we should not be trying to build conscious machines. Why do I think this? Well, imagine if we were successful. If we were successful, firstly, we might not even know that we were successful because, as I've just said, it's very hard to be sure about whether something artificial is conscious or not. And secondly, many conscious experiences are unpleasant. And there's this artificial suffering problem. As soon as we're able to build artificial systems that have conscious experiences, then we've opened the possibility of building at industrial scale systems that may experience suffering. They may experience suffering without us even knowing, and they may experience suffering that we humans would not even be able to recognize as suffering if we saw it, because they have a completely different way of being in the world. So this is a huge ethical issue. We should not be risking introducing new forms of suffering into the world. There's another problem, and this is the last problem, which I call the Westworld problem. And this is what systems that, even if they are not conscious, if they appear to us to be conscious, as in Ex Machina and other science fiction films, if they appear to us to be conscious, that risks doing very damaging things to our own individual psychology. We would treat other systems in different ways, even though they give us the appearance of consciousness. This happens, of course, in the science fiction series Westworld, where people express very depraved behaviors on artificial robots that give the strong appearance of being conscious. And that risks turning all of us into sort of psychopaths of some sort, where we live in a world where we can no longer distinguish between what's real and what's not, and we have to get used to that somehow. And this is actually already happening a little bit with developments in artificial intelligence like GPT-3, which generates very, very plausible language, and this technology of deepfake, which can animate still images so they give a very convincing appearance of being that person. This is all still in the virtual world, but we can already see this on the horizon, that we're going to live in a world where it's very hard, if not impossible, to distinguish what's real from what's not. But I think the possibility of developing artificial consciousness is actually most significant outside the world of robots or AI. and in this technology called brain organoids. This is a very rapidly developing technology where many labs in the world now are beginning to grow brain-like structures in a dish. These are not mini brains, but they have neurons. They wire themselves up in ways which resemble the developing human brain. They're grown from human stem cells, from embryonic stem cells that are extracted from human embryos. And they're very important medically because they allow us to have a much deeper understanding of a lot of neurological diseases and disorders, and so will underpin a lot of important medical developments. And at the moment, they're extremely, extremely simple, so they're very unlikely to be conscious. However, the technology is accelerating very, very rapidly, and these things are grown at industrial scale. And critically, they are made out of neurons. They're made out of the same stuff that brains of animals and humans are made out of. So this whole argument about whether the substrate matters, whether silicon matters or whether carbon matters, is irrelevant here because they're made out of the same thing. So we probably need what I would call a preventative or preemptive ethics for thinking about the technology of organoids. At what stage would they become sufficiently complex when we might have to worry that they might be having conscious experiences? And of course, the issue with these organoids too is they don't behave. They're the exact opposite of something like a deep fake or a robot that we actually have. They don't do anything. They're just in a dish. So it's even harder for us to know whether any kind of conscious experience is going on. They could be islands of awareness, little bits of brain-like stuff that don't interact with the rest of the world, but could nonetheless be having conscious experiences. So these are reasons to be very wary of the objective of developing artificial consciousness, and especially when we look at neurotechnology rather than artificial intelligence. So I want to finish in the last 3 or 4 minutes with what I think a bit more of a positive message. What can we do? What should we be doing? And here I think there's many ways to look forward, much to be excited about. And I'd call it the strength of weak artificial consciousness. And here's the last distinction I want to make. This is between strong artificial consciousness, which is this goal, which I think is not the right goal to have, of building an actually conscious machine. But there's also weak artificial consciousness, which is when we try just to simulate properties of consciousness in machines without building them. Of course, we don't know what it would take to build a conscious machine, so it's dangerous to take this distinction too literally, but we can have them as different aims. And weak artificial consciousness allows us to do very many things which could potentially be very useful. The first thing it can do is it can help us understand biological consciousness. AI can help consciousness science. We need to understand more about how the complex mechanisms in biological brains underpin conscious experiences. And detailed computational models that simulate consciousness can help us with that. I'll give you one very quick example. And on the other hand, consciousness science can help artificial intelligence. AI is very powerful these days, but it's also very rigid and very narrow. It's very good at specific things, but very bad at natural intelligence, at generalizing to new situations, as I mentioned at the outset. We tend to be very good at things that AI is not very good at, and the things that we're good at that AI is not good at tend to be those things that are associated with consciousness for us. We can be aware of new situations, figure out novel responses, integrate lots of information. So maybe by implementing the functions of consciousness in AI, we can build better AI without actually trying to build machines that are actually conscious. So here's just a couple of quick examples. Something we're calling computational phenomenology. We can now begin to use new kinds of neural network to simulate different kinds of visual hallucinations and different kinds of psychedelic situations or hallucinations that people have in neurological illness. This is a sort of extension of that example I showed you with the dogs before. But here we're using machine learning models or artificial intelligence models to understand more about the phenomenology, the experiential properties of vision. And this is going to help us understand how the brain is linked to visual experience. So that's going in one direction. And in the other direction, we can take insights from the mechanisms of human and animal consciousness to build better AI. One thing here is called out of distribution generalization. This is just the more formal technical way of saying being better at dealing with new situations. This is something current AI is not very good at. We're very good at, and we seem to be good at it in virtue of being conscious. There are many other things too that are associated with consciousness in humans and which would be of great benefit to new generations of AI. Active data sampling, looking for data to learn from rather than just passively being fed all the data on the internet. Error monitoring, being aware of your own performance, how well you're doing, and noticing when you make mistakes. This is something that consciousness is very deeply involved in humans. Confidence, this sense of how well we're doing, is something that goes along with consciousness in humans and could be very valuable in AI as well. Imagine a self-driving car that continually had an evaluation of how well it's doing at its job. And finally, perceptual integration. We have conscious experiences that integrate a vast amount of information into a unified scene that allow us to behave flexibly. Current AI systems don't do a very good job at that. And so if we understand the mechanisms underlying that aspect of consciousness, we again have more powerful AI, and so on and so on. So let me finish now. I've hit just a few simple points in this talk. Consciousness is not the same as intelligence. Consciousness and intelligence are very different things. Artificial consciousness will not just come along for the ride as AI gets smarter and smarter. We can't assume that it will. There's no good reason to assume that it will. And there are lots of assumptions that are driving people's intuitions that artificial consciousness is an inevitable consequence of artificial intelligence. Different theories of consciousness predict different things, and depending on the theory of consciousness you believe in, then you may or may not be able to build a conscious machine. And the substrate might matter. So this is the last point. And here, what I mean is, for me at least, there's still an open question that conscious machines might need to be living machines. But certainly, we can only understand human consciousness by understanding the tight relationships between the brain and the living body. Finally, artificial consciousness is something to avoid and not desire, and there are many, many exciting opportunities to not build conscious machines. I'll finish there. Thank you again for letting me speak at this festival, and I do have a book coming out in September talking about consciousness and intelligence, and even conscious machines too. It's going to be available in the UK in September. Gracias.